Hi, everyone. The purpose of this video is to cover Chapter 4 for Speech 1315's public speaking course for Lone Star College Kingwood. Chapter 4 is all about reaching your audience and why it's important to do so. To begin, it is important to note that you do not want to be a self-centered speaker. What this means is that when you get up in front of people, all you're thinking about is how are they going to perceive me? How do I look? What are people thinking about me? You don't want to focus on yourself. Not only will focusing on yourself actually make you more nervous, but it can kind of radiate off of you that you're only concerned about how you're perceived versus what your message could potentially do for the people around you. So you want to be an audience-centered speaker. So you want to focus on the audience members and how your message could enrich or benefit their life. You always want to keep them in mind. This presentation is going to go through a little bit about ways that you can do that. The first way that you can tailor your speech to be more in line for your audience members is to analyze and adapt accordingly. To analyze, you can ask questions like, what does my audience members know? So you need to be mindful of, do my audience members understand this content? Do they already know this information? Do they not already know this information? And then adapt accordingly. So for example, if I was giving a presentation to seniors in college, it wouldn't make a lot of sense for me to give a presentation on how to get into college because they're about to get out. So it's important to assess your audience members. Some ways that you can gain this information is through surveys, which I believe we'll touch on here in a minute. But essentially, whatever you find out about your audience members, you need to be able to adapt accordingly. So if I know that the majority of my audience members are seniors and they're actually not going to be going into college anytime soon, I might tailor my message into how can they help their younger siblings get into college, right? So still the same basis of how to get into college, but I reframed and adapted my message to meet my audience members' needs. Like I said, a way that you can analyze your audience members is through interviews. So you can literally interview them, or you can also do surveys. I'll be honest with you though, as someone who does keynote speeches, there have been many times where I don't have times to do interviews or surveys. I don't have time to assess what my audience members want and need. But something that you can do is maybe right before you give the speech. Let's say for this course, you have 6 of your family members come over and you're about to give a speech on why spaghetti is the best food to eat. You might talk with your family members beforehand and ask them what their favorite food is. If 55% of them say, I hate Italian food, they hate it and they hate spaghetti, you might want to handle objections about spaghetti. You might need to tailor your message to address that. You also need to be mindful of audience diversity. So a lot of times, such as in the classroom, you will be speaking to a diverse group of individuals, people ranging in age, people ranging in ethnicity, religious affiliation backgrounds, and you always want to be respectful and mindful of who's in the room. So again, like I mentioned in previous videos, you never want to stereotype individuals ever or have any type of bias towards any individual within your speech. Some things to be mindful about with audience age is, like I said, gender. Or who are you speaking to, right? If you are at a women's conference and you decide to make a joke or a stab at men, it may not come off very well, especially because there may be some individuals who are men in the audience, like maybe just a small amount, but you never want to say anything that's, again, a bias or stereotype or harmful to someone's gender. Similarly, age, right? You might be in a room full of 18-year-olds and you might make a statement about the older population that isn't very kind. That's not good, right? You always want to be conscientious of gender and age when you are giving a speech. You also want to be mindful of people's educational background. And I say this because this will impact how you tailor the speech. So for example, when I am giving a speech to my peers in academia, I wouldn't simplify some of these concepts as much as I'm simplifying them for someone that I'm teaching. And the reason for that is I'm adapting to my audience members, right? because I want to make my audience members' experience of my message enriching and impactful. And if I'm just using a bunch of big jargon terms about theoretical hypotheses and conceptualizations of concepts, it's not going to be received very well. Similarly, if I'm in a room full of my peers who have been studying communication for 30 plus years, me talking about processes in a very simplistic manner is going to bore them. So always be mindful of people's educational background, because that'll also impact how you tailor your message to them. Also be mindful of people's occupations. So for example, you might be speaking to you might be at a blue collar work event or conference, right? You don't want to make obviously a jab at their occupation or white collars occupations, because you never know who's in the room. You never know who you're going to be talking to, but just always be mindful that you will have a diverse group of individuals, and you want to be conscientious of how you tailor your message to each of them. Similarly, religious affiliations, you never want to say anything that's going to put someone's religion down or bolster someone else's up, right? You don't want to make a statement like, you know, Christianity is the best religion to have. That's subjective. And obviously it's disrespectful to other people's religious affiliations, right? But if you are giving a, you know, speech at a Christian university, you know that you're going to be able to talk about that faith in a very comfortable setting. Obviously, like I've always said, you never want to stereotype or put anyone down or put any other religious affiliation down, but you know that within this context and within these audience members, you may be able to talk about Christianity or Hinduism or Buddhism, whoever you're giving a presentation to, with ease and comfort. And it also is an educational piece, because a lot of times with religious affiliations, there's an educational aspect to it. So for example, with Catholicism, it's a part of Christianity, but it's obviously like a subsect of it. And individuals not in that faith may not know, let's say, for example, all of the rituals that Catholics do throughout a mass ceremony. And so it's really important that if you're talking to Christians who have no idea about how a mass is conducted, you need to explain that information, because they don't have that knowledge or that education to help them understand what you're saying. So with religious affiliation, always remember, just don't put anyone down and be mindful of it. You also need to be mindful of people's economic and social status. You never want to, again, make a statement that is just not mindful of your audience members. So for example, if I'm at a financial health conference and I'm talking about how you can bolster up your revenue for your small business, it would be crude of me to say something along the lines of, I'm sure many of you are poor and don't even know where you're starting out at. It's disrespectful to the audience members. Instead, keep it neutral. You don't know people's backgrounds unless you surveyed them, right? But also too, again, you just don't want to be disrespectful. You want to be mindful of people's economic and social status, and you want to take that into consideration when you are creating your messages. You also want to be mindful of international listeners. A lot of times individuals in other cultures do not understand our social norms in the United States, and vice versa. When you go to other countries, you may not know their social norms. So for example, you want to respect taboos. I believe it's in the Eastern culture, one of the Eastern cultures, that if they offer you a shot of alcohol and you refuse it, it's taboo, because that's disrespectful to them. But in America, if we're trying to finish out a deal and sign a deal with someone and they gave you a shot and you said, oh no, I don't drink, and they kept pressuring you, it would be disrespectful of them to continue to pressure you. So be mindful of cultural norms and respect taboos. Another great example of taboos within the United States is swearing, and also language. So in the South, we say y'all. It is slang for you all. In other parts of the United States, y'all can be seen as a term that doesn't sound very educated, and that's ultimately a stereotype. So you need to be mindful of how you talk and deliver your messages when you're even just talking to people in other parts of the United States. You also need to learn nonverbal signals. There are a lot of different nonverbal signals that audience members, especially international listeners, will do that were discussed in your textbook. And then you also want to avoid ethnocentrism. So always thinking that essentially, essentially the way you think is the right way and how you're brought up is the right way. You always, again, like I said, want to be mindful of other people's cultures. You also want to be mindful of listeners with disabilities, and you basically the best resource, you want to figure out what the best resource is for them. And in the textbook, it talks about like, if you need to know what the best resource is for them, just ask their interpreter, ask them if they're able to communicate effectively, but they know what's the best for them to be able to hear the message. So for example, you might have listeners with disabilities such as mobility impairments. They may need to move closer to the stage. You might have listeners who are deaf, and you may need to have words on the screen. I always have words on the screen because I just never know who I am going to be teaching to, and I think that it's really helpful to have captions. But you also might have listeners who are blind or visually impaired, and so you just want to make sure that you have proper resources for them. For example, I had a student one time who couldn't see very well, and also couldn't hear very well. And so I, through the university, was able to get an assistant, like co-student for this individual who shared notes with them, shared notes with their assistant, and they were able to learn the content effectively. So always be mindful of your audience and aware of where they're, if they have disabilities, and make sure to try and accommodate them so that they can also gain some insight from your speech. You also want to be mindful of the audience's knowledge. I spoke on this a little bit earlier, but if an audience member knows a lot about your topic, you may need to find additional and current information about that topic so that they can also find the speech enriching. So for example, I'm going and giving a keynote speech in September, and I know that the individuals in that room are going to know a lot about the concepts that I'm talking about. And so I want to bring them something new and exciting that maybe they haven't heard before. And so that's how I would adapt to my audience's knowledge. But now let's say that my audience knows too little or nothing about the topic. Then I would need to be mindful about that. And I might need to prepare my speech to accommodate for the time that it will take for me to explain the concepts associated with the topic I'm discussing. You also need to assess the audience's psychology, aka their interest level. So you, again, can assess this with the survey of how interested are they in with the topic and create interest. Are these individuals who paid to come to this conference and they want to hear you speak? They signed up personally. They flew in from five different states away to come hear you speak? Or is this a room of individuals who are forced to come in and hear you present? And if that is the case where you have a group of individuals who don't want to be there, but they are there and they have to listen to you, you're going to have to create interest for them. What are their attitudes towards the goal of the speech? So let's say that I'm trying to get a room of audience members to understand why it's important to communicate more effectively. If they have unfavorable views on this, I will have to handle objections, which I'll talk a little bit more when it comes to persuasive speaking. But basically, I'm going to have to handle their doubts. I'm going to have to address it. If they have neutral, I am going to have to have I'm going to have to win them over. And similarly with the unfavorable ones, and I'll probably have to handle objections, but not as extensively as I have to do with the unfavorable. Also with the unfavorable, let's say I'm given an informative speech and I know that nobody really wants to listen to what I have to say, I might add in additional time for Q&A so I can handle their questions to make them feel like they've really gotten something out of the speech. But now let's say that I have a group of individuals who love communication. I mean, it's their bread and butter and they just are super favorable. Again, I wouldn't have to necessarily win them over, and I may not even have to handle objections, but I would just have to give them enough content to solidify their viewpoints. And that would be, again, me tailoring my message to my audience members. Again, going towards audience psychology, you need to be mindful of the attitudes toward the speaker. So how do they feel about the speaker? that's something that you need to take into consideration, and especially attitudes towards the occasion. Again, is this an occasion that they were forced to be at, or is this something that they wanted to be at? Also too, what is going back to the speaker, attitudes towards the speaker? Think of power differences between the speaker and the listeners. If you're in a corporate boardroom and the CEO, who, you know, has really just been horrible all year, and, you know, you're about to introduce them, you know, to the board members, you might need to take into consideration people's attitudes and maybe even give them a pep talk before the CEO comes in, respectfully, right? Obviously. But these are, again, just attitudes towards the speaker and the occasion can really impact how people view your speech, and are, again, things you need to be mindful of when creating your speech. As previously mentioned, or now moving on to the occasion, which we kind of just briefly talked about, but you want to make sure that your attire is respectful of the occasion. As you can see, this individual is probably at a military occasion, ceremony event, and they are being respectful with how they dress. They are punctual. Depending on all the occasions, you need to be punctual, or on time, or even early. You want to be mindful of who's going to be there, how your nonverbals are, and again, just respectful of the audience members and the context in which you're going to be speaking in. As mentioned, you need to be respectful of the time limit with whatever occasion. So let's say, for example, you are allotted an hour and a half to give a speech and on a particular topic because you're an expert on it. If you go and speak for 3 hours, people are going to be upset. But similarly, if you only present for 30 minutes, that's going to be a problem. And especially in the keynote speaking world, a lot of times they pay you to speak. And so if I'm getting paid thousands of dollars to speak for an hour and a half, and I only present for 30 minutes, there's going to be ramifications. I may not get all my funds or whatever it might be. So you need to be mindful of the time limit associated with the occasion. You need to be mindful of the expectations. What are they expecting from you? Are they expecting you to give a PowerPoint? Are they expecting you to show a video? Are they expecting you to do a Q&A or an interactive session? So be mindful of their expectations. Also be mindful of other people who are speaking at the event or other events on the program. I always put this in context for the classmates, right? So let's say you're in a room full of 20 people and you have to get up and give a 7-minute speech, and you take 15 minutes. Well, you just cut into Susie Q's time and it threw off the whole class. And that's just not being mindful of your audience members or the occasion. And it's really important to be empathetic to other people who are also presenting. And then finally, audience members, or the size of the audience members. Are you speaking to 5 people or are you speaking to 2,000 people? This really makes a huge difference, and it'll impact how you present, how you interact with them, as well as your PowerPoint slides. Now, how do you adapt during the speech? So let's say you've prepped for 2 months to give this speech and you have to adapt. How do you do that? You ultimately do that, sorry for going a little too early. You ultimately do that through just being mindful of your audience members and working on the fly. It's okay to cut things. It's okay to extend things. So for example, let's say you are giving a data analytics speech on a Friday afternoon at 4 o'clock to a room of 12 boardroom members. Do you think Friday at 4 o'clock they really want to hear about data? Probably not. So you need to be able to adapt your speech and maybe shorten it and say, hey, I know that we really don't want to hear about numbers. I'm going to get through the beef of this. I'm going to send out an email with the highlights on Monday, but I want to get through this so that we can discuss it, have a Q&A, and then be able to go on our weekend. Versus, let's imagine that same scenario. It's, 4 p.m. on a Monday. You may take the full hour to give your presentation on data analytics. But regardless, you need to be mindful and able to adapt your speech depending on the context, the individuals in the room, and the circumstances. Now, here are some tips for your career. 1, it's important to be sensitive to audience members' discomfort. Like I was mentioning, if you are in a boardroom in your corporate job and you see people yawning in the middle of your speech, is it 8 a.m. in the morning? Have you been talking for 2 hours? Maybe people need to go get coffee and then they can come back and feel better. You just need to be sensitive to audience members. You need to work closely with interpreters. So again, when it comes to individuals who need assistance with understanding your message, you need to work closely with the interpreters in your field. And again, be prepared to trim your remarks like I was talking about a minute ago when it came to adapting your speech. I hope that by the end of this presentation, you have gained some insight into the importance of adapting your speech to your audience members. You're going to end up having a better speech. You're going to notice that when you tailor your speech to the audience members, they're going to get more out of it. So throughout the remainder of the semester, be mindful of your audience members throughout the entire process. And it is a pro tip that will help you be a better public speaker. Have a great day.